Guys, good morning. Welcome to the podcast. And thanks for joining. My name is Andy. I'm the clinical lead here at ReadyCare. So in today's session, what we're going to be talking about is understanding the real risks for heart disease. Now, I say the real risks because the paradigm over the last 30 or 40 years has been, in retrospect, wild in the sense that we managed to convince a group of people, but only in the Western world, that the foods we've been eating for 2.4 million years, certainly 200,000 years in our current form, were suddenly killing us in meat and eggs and saturated fat. But it was only happening in the Western world because them lads out in the remote tribes saw no such increase in heart disease. And it didn't happen to your grandparents either. So in all of our human evolution, it was only since the early to mid 70s when this notion came that it might be saturated fat and red meat increasing the risk of cancer and heart disease. And there is a well-funded, intentional narrative being pushed forward from various different sectors with vested interests to kind of point the finger at red meat, saturated fat, and basically ancient ancestral foods and demonize them. So part of that narrative is coming from the whole climate change side of things, and that's a separate sort of a thing. And the other half is coming from I'm sorry, my microphone is after getting unplugged. Excuse me 1 second. There we go. So half of that is coming from, let me just check that. I'm sorry, because I'm having an issue here with my microphone. Aha, got it. Sorry, apologies, guys. Okay, so yeah, so some of it is coming from the climate change side of things, and the other is coming from a religious sort of ideology, more specifically World Health Organization type organizations who have, almost all their board of advisors are 7-day Adventists, and it's in their interest to say vegan, vegetarian is the way to go. Red meat increases your risk of heart disease. Saturated fat is suddenly killing you. It didn't for the last 2.4 million years, but it might be now. So just to be clear, there is no study, there are no data that says red meat does increase your risk for heart disease. There is no study, there are no data that say saturated fat definitely does clog up your arteries. These are, if you look at any of the titles in the studies, which are not studies, they're epidemiological papers of observation, where they say one thing is correlated with another. I'll explain that in a second. The headlines will be, scientists warn, studies say there may be a connection between, or eating red meat may be associated with an increased risk of, or eating 3 portions of meat a week increases your risk of diabetes, which is complete and utter nonsense. You will never see causes. You will never see is definitively shown, because you can't show those things. There's no such thing as following a group of people who eat nothing but meat for 100 years and a group of people who eat vegetarian diets for 100 years and comparing them. Those studies don't exist. It'd be very difficult to carry out. So the main thing to know here is that when you hear something around red meat increases your risk or may increase your risk, or the other one that's a really clever way of phrasing it, depending on what narrative you want to spin, is has been associated with. Like, what a ridiculous term has been associated with. So I'll just say I'm a scientist. My background is I have a master's in human nutrition and I have a master's in human physiology. And my job all day, every day is to look at research papers and just kind of pull the correct conclusions and have advice for patients based on that. So I understand very well how to interpret the clinical literature. Unfortunately, the general public usually don't. And you just get a headline that says, 1 week it'll say eating more than 2 portions of meat a week increases your risk for diabetes. Because that's coming from someone who wants to spin that narrative and has paid a study to come up with that favorable outcome. And then you see another study literally a couple of weeks later, maybe even in the same paper, that will say an all-meat diet reverses diabetes, like a carnivore diet. So how can those two things be true? How can they be true? So you will see things like saturated fat is bad for you. That's the old school idea. And red meat might increase your risk of diabetes and cancer. Yet we literally treat cardiovascular patients with a red meat diet. It's not an exclusively red meat diet. It's a low carb, or more like a ketogenic diet, which is low carbs and sugar, and higher proportionally to a standard diet where you eat a lot of bland beige carbohydrates and stuff, is higher in meat, yet it reverses diabetes. So how can eating a higher amount of meat increase your risk of diabetes? If we've published studies that have won international awards showing reduced cardiovascular risk, reduced diabetes risk, in fact, reversing diabetes, putting diabetes in remission is the correct term. About 48% of our patients will reverse their diabetes. And all of our patients on webinars go, how is this possible that we've all reversed our diabetes? And I'm reading in the Daily Mail, eating red meat might increase your risk of diabetes or cancer. Now, if you reverse someone's diabetes and their heart health improves and their cholesterol gets better and their blood sugar levels are under control, you by definition have hugely reduced the risk of getting cancer. So how could eating those foods increase your risk of cancer? So both of these things, both of these narratives will exist at the same time. And it's a matter of being able to look at the literature, look at the data and see what it says in terms of what does it actually say? And what did these so-called studies actually show? So let me just bring you through a couple of slides here. If anyone has any questions, technical or otherwise, please pop them in the comments as we go along. And we'll just do a quick 10 minutes here. So in terms of our expertise, I suppose, around cardiovascular health, we don't come up with, controversial notions and say, actually, red meat is not bad for you. And we think that saturated fat should be fine. We put our patients, after careful consideration and 10 years of research, on lower carb diets that by their nature, you're going to eat more meat and eggs and cheese if you're eating less carbohydrates. By their nature, proportionally, they would be higher in saturated fat and red meat. And patients following that type of a diet, which is known as a whole food, low carb, healthy fat diet, saw 48% remission of type 2. So type 2 went away. Weight loss of about 1 stone and 2 pounds over 8 weeks. Waist reductions of about 3 inches. Triglycerides, which are fats in your liver that spill out into your bloodstream, reduction of 15%, which is huge. And blood pressure going down 11% on average. Systolic, that's the top number. So when you hear 130 over 80 or 120 over 80, it's the 120 number that goes way down. The bottom number goes down as well, but just a little bit less. So we published got a number of papers now at this stage. We've won international awards. Myself and the team won the International Scholar Award in 2020 and the Clinical Pharmacy Congress Award for the overall winner of Excellence in General Practice. So we've won awards internationally from American Heart Associations and other NHS Excellence in General Practice. They're not easy to get. You don't get those on controversial notions. This is really well thought out in terms of looking at the literature. So why do we blame cholesterol? And that's, by the way, that's the whole idea that red meat increases your risk of heart disease is because animal foods contain relatively higher levels of cholesterol. So does seafood. And interestingly, most people would suppose that fish and seafood is really good for you and good for your heart. Yes, yet it's full of cholesterol. So there's lots of this mixed messages. But red meat in particular, fattier cuts of red meat, cream, eggs, all that sort of stuff. They would have said, well, that contains cholesterol, and patients who have heart disease end up with cholesterol in their arteries. Therefore, you should eat less cholesterol, which is just absolutely awful, awful, awful advice. And the guidelines have changed around this. The reason it's awful advice is it's understandable how we came to this misunderstanding, because if you look at the arteries of someone who's had a quadruple bypass and they've died, and had a massive heart attack, I should say, not a quad bypass, had a massive heart attack and died, you look at their arteries, you have their arteries, you do a cross-section of them, and you will absolutely categorically see lots of cholesterol built up. It actually doesn't build up in the artery itself like it would in a pipe in your kitchen. It goes in under what's known as a subentima. It kind of buries in through here. So it's almost through a different layer. But that layer, then when it starts to bulge like that, it starts to occlude the artery, and then we call that atherosclerosis, or narrowing of the artery walls. So if you cut open the artery, you will absolutely see cholesterol. But the question is not, how can we eat less cholesterol? The real intelligent question would be, well, let's figure out why was the cholesterol there in the first place? Because surely 2.4 million years of human evolution, and God, Mother Nature, whoever you believe in, didn't put animals there for us to eat, and fish and fruits and vegetables, only for those foods to hijack our bloodstream and try and kill us. Surely the body's not that stupid. And it's definitely not. So the reason that cholesterol builds up in your arteries has little or nothing to do with your dietary intake of cholesterol. Hugely important to know, which exonerates red meat in terms of leading to heart disease. The reason cholesterol builds up in your arteries is because it's responding to inflammation and oxidative stress. So looking at the arteries and go, well, cholesterol builds up and that clogs up your arteries, therefore I need to eat less cholesterol, is entirely wrong. And here's a stat that you need to know. If you never eat any meat, eggs, cheese, cream, any dietary cholesterol, seafood ever again, your body will make 85% of the cholesterol it needs. Your liver will just produce it because it needs it so badly. So this idea, cholesterol equals bad, and we should take drugs to lower it and focus on eating less cholesterol, is just absolutely barking up the wrong tree. So blaming cholesterol for responding to inflammation and trying to help it, and then getting blocked up over time because you kept inflaming your arteries, and saying cholesterol is the problem, we need to lower it and we need to eat less cholesterol, is pretty comparable to and akin to arriving on the scene of a fire every time and going, I mean, this is done and dusted, lads. It's definitely the firefighters who are setting the fire, because every time we go to a building that's an inferno, that's on fire and out of control, the firefighters are always there, therefore they caused the fire. It really is. That's an analogy used by a lot of top physiology experts who are really good at cholesterol. Okay, so a really important thing to know about cholesterol, a minimum of 75 up to 85% of the cholesterol that ends up floating through your bloodstream is made by your liver. If you go vegan or vegetarian and never eat any cholesterol again, it will not necessarily lower your cholesterol levels in terms of what builds up in your arteries. Your body will say, I need that for hundreds of cellular processes around the body, therefore I'm going to make it. It's got loads of key functions, from making cell membranes, bile production. It makes your hormones. So you wouldn't have estrogen, progesterone, cortisone, testosterone, vitamin D. You'd have none of those things without cholesterol. So this idea that I want to get my cholesterol as low as possible is just, it's really silly. It's beyond reductionist. I personally like my cholesterol to be what my doctor would consider to be on the high side. Okay, and this is important as well because it relates to red meat, saturated fat, all this sort of stuff. So this is a paper from UCLA a couple of years back showing, this confused everyone who believed cholesterol was the problem. 75% of patients hospitalized for a heart attack had cholesterol levels that would indicate, if you didn't know your stuff or you were working off the old guidelines, would indicate that they were not a high risk for a heart attack. So basically, they had cholesterol levels below 5. Now, we'll do a whole nother session over the next couple of weeks on why that is. But basically, it comes down to your total number, which is the number your doctor quotes, like your cholesterol is 6.2. You need to go on a medication to lower it, which in the face of the literature of the last number of years sounds like a ridiculous suggestion. What your doctor should be saying to you, and they likely won't because there's so many other things to be looking out for. As a friend of mine says, Andy, you give me abuse for not understanding cholesterol levels, but I have to know every first hint of a rare cancer to examining fungal toenails and everything in between. Everything in between. So, you know, this sort of, you should know all about the latest science on cholesterol. Like, it's just, I don't have time. That's what he would say to me, which is fair. At least he's being honest. So 75% of patients hospitalized for heart attack did not have cholesterol levels over 5. They were below 5. Okay, so this is really important. The idea that cholesterol and meat and eggs and cheese would somehow adversely affect your heart disease risk. I suppose, just for a second, just to take a step back, because this is very important. The idea that it wasn't just plucked out of thin air. It kind of was. It wasn't plucked out of thin air. It was pulled from what are known as epidemiological papers, epidemiological research. So there are different levels of research. Epidemiology is just down at the bottom next to an expert's opinion. So the highest level of evidence is known as a randomized controlled trial, where you take, and you can't do this in the real world, but you would take 1,000 patients and you would put them, you'd split them into 500 on either side. You'd put one group on a meat and eggs and cheese and saturated fat only diet for 10 years. Again, you can see why that wouldn't be plausible. And you take the other group and you put them on a vegetarian diet with absolutely no animal products, which would be immoral because they'd waste away and lose muscle mass and get mental health problems and all the other stuff we see with extreme vegan diets. If you did that, you would be able to say, well, we randomized these two groups and we accounted for all the confounding variables in terms of, we compared non-smokers with non-smokers, people who exercise a lot with people who exercise a lot. And then you could say, if you accounted for all those confounding variables, things that could confuse the data and the correlations, you could say it's pretty cut and dry. People who ate a meat-only diet got less heart disease than people who ate a vegan or vegetarian diet, and that would likely be the outcome. But we can't do that. So what they do is they will look, if they're looking to spin a particular narrative, I say they, could be pharmaceutical industry, could be World Health Organization type organizations who have a very obvious bias in the fact that they're vegan, and 3 of the 4 board of advisors are 7-day Adventists, which is, I suppose, I want to be respectful, but it is quite an extreme ideology insofar as religion goes. Certainly as diet relates to it, because they believe that red meat is evil and saturated fat and eggs and cheese and red meat makes you think unholy thoughts, that kind of stuff. So it's extreme in that sense, while being respectful to their beliefs. So what organizations will do, and these study writers who are usually funded by industry will say, is they'll say, we looked at people's diets for 30 years. This is just crazy. People's diets for 30 years. And once a year, we sent them out an email that says, can you fill in the survey? How many portions of red meat did you eat every week for the last year? How many portions of nuts? How much grains did you have? How much? All that sort of stuff. And then they will also say, how much did you smoke? How much alcohol do you drink? How active are you? And they take all of this data. Now, I put that in inverted commas there kind of sarcastically, because I genuinely will struggle to remember what I ate yesterday. Like, I don't think that's a crazy thing to say. Sorry, excuse me for 2 seconds. Sorry, guys, my wife was just calling me there, not knowing I'm on a webinar. So the other thing that's important to consider here is what we're looking at in those studies is, instead of doing a randomized control trial, they will take one set of data that is all of the information about these people and the 60 or 70 different factors from did they smoke, did they exercise, and so on. And then they'll go, oh, the people who ate more red meat got more cancer, and they pick a cancer, so it won't be all cancers because that doesn't happen. They'll go colorectal, therefore meat causes cancer. But what you're not taking into consideration in those studies, which is wild, is you're not saying, did they smoke? Did they exercise? When they were eating red meat, was it in McDonald's and a burger? And in that instance, were they also having fries and milkshake? It doesn't matter. All those other variables are thrown to the side because one thing fits the narrative. So epidemiology is, I won't use the expression, but poor for showing 2 things. One thing causes another. And that's why you will see people going on meat-only diets that are low in sugar for reversing heart disease. And you're going, well, how is that even possible? And improving your cholesterol. I've seen people on carnivore diets, which is an all-meat diet, in preclinical early stage studies, reversing things like Alzheimer's, stopping cancer in its tracks, some of the hormone positive cancers in particular, reversing diabetes. I see all the time. It's incredible for weight loss and cholesterol levels. So this idea that red meat increases your risk of cancer, I'm trying to be polite about it, is just straight up nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Okay, and I'll just finish on one last thing that I just want you to observe here. If red meat increases your risk of heart disease, why is there no heart disease in the Inuit tribe who eat almost exclusively red meat? They eat seal blubber, caribou, which is reindeer, colossal amounts of meat, saturated fat. They do not get cancer. It doesn't make sense. So to sum up, we have been conned in the Western world into thinking that processed food is not the problem. Don't be worrying about the Cheerios and the sugary granola bars and the Pop-Tarts and stuff with fillers, emulsifiers, and industrial seed oils that is definitely causing cancer and diabetes. It's probably meat and eggs and cheese that has been around in its current form for 2.4 million years. It's just not the case. Guys, sorry for the interruptions there. I hope you found that useful, and we'll see you at the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.